The following account was written by Lili Dehn, a close friend of the last Empress of Russia, Alexandra Fyodorovna. She witnessed many of the most important events of the sunset years of the Romanov dynasty. Her words consist an intimate first-hand account from the perspective of a palace insider and close friend of Alexandra.
The Grand Duchesses were fast leaving childhood behind them and blossoming into charming girls. They did not greatly resemble one another. Each was a type apart, but all were equally lovely in disposition. I cannot believe that any men so inhuman existed as those who it is said shot and stabbed those defenseless creatures in the house of death at Yekaterinburg. Apart from their beauty, their sweetness should have pleaded for them, but if it is true that they have passed, then surely no better epitaph could be theirs than the immortal words, "Lovely and pleasant were they in their lives, and in their death they were not divided." The Grand Duchess Olga was the eldest of these four fair sisters. She was a most amiable girl, and people loved her from the moment they set eyes on her. As a child, she was plain. At 15 she was beautiful. She was slightly above middle height, with a fresh complexion, deep blue eyes, quantities of light chestnut hair, and pretty hands and feet. She took life seriously, and she was a clever girl, with a sweet disposition. I think she possessed unusual strength of character, and at one time, she was mentioned as a possible bride for the Crown Prince of Romania. But the Grand Duchess did not like him, and as the Crown Prince liked the Grand Duchess Marie better than her sister, nothing came of the project. The Grand Duchess Tatiana was as charming as her sister Olga, but in a different way. She has been described as proud, but I never knew anyone less so. With her, as with her mother, shyness and reserve were accounted as pride. But once you knew her and had gained her affection, this reserve disappeared, and the real Tatiana became apparent. She was a poetical creature, always yearning for the ideal, and dreaming of great friendships which might be hers. The emperor loved her devotedly, they had much in common, and the sisters used to laugh and say that if a favor were required, Tatiana must ask Papa to grant it. She was very tall and excessively thin, with a cameo-like profile, deep blue eyes, and dark chestnut hair, a lovely rose maiden, fragile and pure as a flower. When I first knew the Grand Duchess Marie, she was quite a child, but during the Revolution, she became very devoted to me, and I to her, and we spent most of our time together. She was a wonderful girl, possessed of tremendous reserve force, and I never realized her unselfish nature until those dreadful days. She too was exceeding fair, dowered with the classic beauty of the Romanovs. Her eyes were dark blue, shaded by long lashes, and she had masses of dark brown hair. Marie was plump, and the Empress often teased her about this. She was not so lively as her sisters, but she was much more decided in her outlook. The Grand Duchess Marie knew at once what she wanted, and why she wanted it. Anastasia, the youngest Grand Duchess, might have been composed of quicksilver instead of flesh and blood. She was most amusing, and she was a very clever mimic. She saw the humorous side of everything, and she was very fond of acting. Indeed, Anastasia would have made an excellent comedy actress. She was always in mischief, a regular tomboy, but she was not backward in her development, as Monsieur Gilliard once stated. Anastasia was only 16 at the time of the Revolution, no great age after all. She was pretty, but hers was more of a clever face, and her eyes were wells of intelligence. The sisters loved each other and united in a passionate adoration for their brother. In a recent book, published in England, The Grand Duchesses have been described as Cinderellas, who were entirely subservient in family life, owing to the attention paid to their brother. This is untrue. It is a fact that the Empress ardently desired a son, and that the birth of 4 daughters in succession was a disappointment to her. But she loved her daughters. They were her inseparable companions, and their plain and rather strict upbringing had nothing whatever of the Cinderella element. The year 1912, although destined to end in the almost fatal illness of the Tsarevich, began happily for the Imperial family. Peaceful and busy were the winter and spring. The Emperor engaged as usual with the affairs of the Empire. The Empress, as far as her health permitted, superintending the education of her children, and all of them busy with their books and their various tutors. Of the education and upbringing of the children of Nicholas II and the Empress Alexandra, it should be said that while nothing was omitted to make them most loyal Russians, the educational methods employed were cosmopolitan. They had French, Swiss, and English tutors, but all their studies were under the superintendence of a Russian, the highly cultured Monsieur Petrov, while for certain branches, such as physics and natural science, they were privately instructed in the gymnasium of Tsarskoe Selo. The first teacher of the Imperial children, she from whom they received their elementary education, was Miss Schneider, familiarly called Trina, a native of one of the Baltic states of the Empire. Miss Schneider first came into service, years before the marriage of the Emperor and Empress, as instructor in the Russian language to Elizabeth, Grand Duchess Serge. Afterwards, she taught Russian to the young Empress, and was retained at court as reader to Her Majesty. Perhaps the most valued of the instructors was Monsieur Pierre Gilliard, whose book 13 Years at the Russian Court has been published in several languages and has been very well received. Monsieur Gilliard, a Swiss gentleman of many accomplishments, came first to Tsarskoe Selo as teacher of French to the young Grand Duchesses. Afterwards, he became tutor to the Tsarevich. Mr. Gibbs, the English tutor, was also a great favorite. Both of these men followed the family into exile, and remained faithful and devoted friends, until forcibly expelled by the Bolsheviks. In his book, Monsieur Gilliard has recorded that he was never able to teach the Grand Duchesses to speak fluent French. This is true, because the languages used in the family were English and Russian, and the children never became interested in any other languages. Trina was supposed to teach them German, but she had less success with that language than Monsieur Gilliard with French. The Emperor and Empress spoke English almost exclusively. Among themselves, the children usually spoke Russian. The Tsarevich alone, thanks to his constant association with Monsieur Gilliard, mastered the French language. Every detail of the education of her children was supervised by the Empress, who often sat with them for hours together in the schoolroom. She, herself, taught them sewing and needlework, her best pupil being Tatiana, who had an extraordinary talent for all kinds of handwork. She not only made beautiful blouses and other garments, embroideries and crochets, but she was able on occasions to arrange her mother's long hair, and to dress her as well as a professional maid. All of them, even the delicate little Tsarevich, slept in large nurseries, on hard camp beds without pillows, and with the least possible allowance of bed clothing. They had cold baths every morning, and warm ones only at night. As a consequence of this simple life, their manners were unassuming and natural, without a single trace of hauteur. Although in 1912 the 4 girls were rapidly approaching womanhood, their parents continued to regard them as children. The 2 older girls were spoken of as the big ones, and were given many grown-up privileges, as for example concerts and the theatre, to which the Emperor himself escorted them. Of the four girls, Olga and Marie were essentially Russian, altogether Romanov in their inheritance. Olga was perhaps the cleverest of them all, her mind being so quick to grasp ideas, so absorbent of knowledge, that she learned almost without application or close study. Her chief characteristics, I should say, were a strong will and a singularly straightforward habit of thought and action. Admirable qualities in a woman, these same characteristics are often trying in childhood, and Olga as a little girl sometimes showed herself willful and even disobedient. She had a hot temper, which however she early learned to keep under control, and had she been allowed to live her natural life, I believe she would have become a woman of influence and distinction. Extremely pretty, with brilliant blue eyes, and a lovely complexion, Olga resembled her father in the fineness of her features, especially in her delicate, slightly tipped nose. Marie and Anastasia were also blonde types, and very attractive girls. Marie had splendid eyes, and rose-red cheeks. She was inclined to be stout, and she had rather thick lips, which detracted a little from her beauty. Marie had a naturally sweet disposition, and a very good mind. All three of these girls were more or less of the tomboy type. They had something of the innate brusqueness of their Romanov ancestors, which displayed itself in a tendency to mischief. Anastasia, a sharp and clever child, was a very monkey for jokes, some of them at times almost too practical for the enjoyment of others. I remember once, when the family was in their Polish estate in winter, the children were amusing themselves at snowballing. The imp which sometimes seemed to possess Anastasia led her to throw a stone, rolled in a snowball, straight at her dearly loved sister Tatiana. The missile struck the poor girl fairly in the face with such force that she fell senseless to the ground. The grief and horror of Anastasia lasted for many days, and permanently cured her of her worst propensities to practical jokes. Tatiana was almost a perfect reincarnation of her mother. Taller and slenderer than her sisters, she had the soft refined features and the gentle reserved manners of her English ancestry. Kind and sympathetic of disposition, she displayed towards her younger sisters and her brother such a protecting spirit that they nicknamed her the Governess. Of all the Grand Duchesses, Tatiana was the most popular with the people, and I suspect in their hearts she was the most dearly loved of her parents. Certainly she was a different type from the others, even in appearance. Her hair being a rich brown, and her eyes so darkly grey, that in the evening they seemed quite black. Of all the girls, Tatiana was most social in her tastes. She liked society, and she longed pathetically for friends. But friends for these highborn, yet unfortunate girls, were very difficult to find. The Empress dreaded for her daughters the companionship of over-sophisticated young women of the aristocracy, whose minds even in the schoolroom were fed with the foolish and often vicious gossip of a decadent society. The Empress even discouraged association with cousins and near relatives, many of whom were unwholesomely precocious in their outlook on life. I would not give the impression that these young daughters of the Emperor and Empress were forced to lead dull and uneventful lives. They were allowed to have their little preferences for handsome young officers, with whom they danced, played tennis, walked, or rode. These innocent young romances were in fact a source of amusement to their majesties, who enjoyed teasing the girls about any dashing officer who seemed to attract them. The Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, sister of the Emperor, sympathized with her niece's love of pleasure, and often arranged tea parties and tennis matches for them. The guests, of course, were of their own choice. We had some quite jolly tea parties in my little house also. In the matter of dress, so important to young and pretty girls, the Grand Duchesses were allowed to indulge their own tastes. Mademoiselle Brissac, an accomplished French dressmaker, made gowns for the Imperial family, and through her, the latest Paris models reached the palace. The girls, however, inclined towards simple English fashions, especially for outdoor wear. In summer, they dressed almost entirely in white. They were too young to wear jewels, except on very great occasions. Each girl received on her 12th birthday a slender gold bracelet, which was afterwards always worn day and night for good luck. How unbelievably far away, now seem those peaceful days of 1912, when we were watching the Tsar's daughters growing towards womanhood, and even in our minds, speculating on possible marriages for them.
Baroness Sophie Buxhoeveden was a Baltic German lady-in-waiting, in service to Empress Alexandra of Russia. She was the author of 3 memoirs about the Imperial family, and about her own escape from Russia. The following account consists of her memories of Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov.
On August 12, 1904, the longed-for son, the heir Alexei, was born. Those who knew how the Empress had prayed and waited for this crowning happiness in her married life, and who understood the importance of direct succession in a country like Russia, can realize what this meant to her. The boy was big and healthy, and early gave promise of great good looks. No signs of the hemophilia that afterwards developed in him were noticeable at the outset. Notwithstanding the serious atmosphere caused by the war, the baby's advent gave unmitigated joy to the parents. My sunbeam, the Empress used to call her boy. The birth of Alexei gave the Empress popularity. The criticism that had been heard of her too great domesticity was heard no more. The Empress had done her duty to the country, and the knowledge of this gave her greater self-confidence. The baby was beautiful. He developed rapidly and seemed a strong, fine child. His teething gave him no trouble, and he was exceptionally bright and well developed. The proud parents exhibited the splendid little fellow to the public whenever they could. He was not a year old when in his mother's arms he was shown to the soldiers at a review, and baby behaved well. When he started trotting about independently and had occasional tumbles, the Empress noticed that the boy seemed to suffer more from his bumps than the small accident warranted. In deadly terror, but without speaking of it to anyone, Alexandra watched her darling with a fear in her heart, that she did not dare to put into words. As the child grew older and more active, he developed the typical swellings that pointed to hemophilia, the dreadful disease from which one of her uncles had suffered, and the Empress realized that her only son, her beloved Sunbeam, had the same terrible weakness. Doctors confirmed her fears, though they said that the heir was suffering from a mild form only of the disease. His mother's despair can be imagined at hearing her worst fears confirmed. Her agony was the more acute, as she knew that it was through her that the boy had inherited the illness. She was in no way to blame, but this did not lessen her terrible feeling of responsibility. Both she and the Emperor hid their anxieties from the world, hoping against hope that there might be some mistake. Alexei was perfectly well and strong between his attacks, which were caused only by some rash movement on his part, and the Empress always hoped that in the intervals a merciful providence had wrought a miracle. Once, 2 whole years passed without a single hemorrhage. The mother revived, her health improved, she looked her former self. Alas! It proved to be a forlorn hope. The boy fell ill again, and though the cause was hidden from everyone, and the parents still trusted that he might completely recover, the doctors had few illusions. This grief destroyed the Empress's joy in life. The look of sadness that had always from time to time come over her face, now settled on it forever. For the sake of her boy's future, she hid her sorrow so well, that in the country the nature of the heir's complaint was unknown. It was whispered about in the palace, but even there, no one knew definitely what was the reason of his frequent sudden illnesses. The strain under which she lived told gradually on the Empress's health. She was obliged to keep more and more to her sofa. Her heart began to trouble her in 1908. She never complained. It was even difficult to make her say how she really felt, but any exertion became such a visible effort that the doctors warned the Emperor about her health, and a cure at Norheim was prescribed. The Empress disliked intensely the idea of making a fuss about herself. She said to her sister the Princess Louis of Battenberg, it was despairing. In another letter to her, on June 5, 1910, she wrote, "Don't think my ill health depresses me personally. I don't care, except to see my dear ones suffer on my account, and that I cannot fulfill my duties. But once God sends such a cross, it must be borne. Darling Mama also lost her health at an early age. I have had so much, that willingly I give up any pleasures. They mean so little to me, and my family life is such an ideal one, that it is a recompense for anything I cannot take part in. Baby is growing a little companion to his father. They row together daily. All 5 lunch with him daily, even when I am laid up. Alexei was not impressed by his own importance, and his simple courteous manner was like his father's. He knew and felt that he was the heir, and from babyhood mechanically took his place in front of his elder sisters. But he took no pride in the position that he knew was his due, and after the revolution gave it up quite quietly, without a word. His chief friend was the son of Dr. Derevenko, and as a small child he played with the sons of his sailor servant, whose name also, curiously enough, was Derevenko. All the children adored their mother, but her constant care of him made a particular bond of love between mother and son. When the Emperor left for General Headquarters in 1915, Alexei said to me that he felt he was the man in the house. It was delightful to see the grown-up way, in which he would look after the Empress, when they went to church, or to some function together. He would help her to rise, or would unobtrusively push a chair towards her, as the Emperor might have done. From the very first, the Empress looked after her children's education herself. She gave them their first spelling lessons and taught them their prayers, going up each evening to pray with them, a custom which she kept up to the end with Alexei. As the children grew older, they had of course their own teachers. The heir had an excellent tutor in Monsieur Pierre Gilliard, a Swiss, who was helped after 1915 by an English colleague, Mr. Sidney Gibbs. Alexandra was economical, and knew the value of money. She dressed well, but not extravagantly. She chose the clothes that suited her type, and hated the extremes of fashion. She looked magnificent in full dress, and was always beautiful. She never impoverished the treasury, by having costly jewels bought for herself. She had many fine jewels that were family heirlooms. Most of the crown jewels were still worn by the Dowager Empress, but as the big tiaras she wore on state occasions, were the crown jewels put aside for the wife of the heir. She used laughingly to say that when Alexei married, she would have to hand them over, and do what she could for herself. For many years, she had believed that bad luck pursued the Emperor and herself. For Alexei, on the other hand, she had the greatest hopes. She was ready to bear everything, in order that he might come into his inheritance. His reign should be glorious, he should institute the reforms for which his parents would slowly prepare. She believed, with a fatalism that she shared with the Emperor, that they were the scapegoats for all the errors committed in previous reigns. Perhaps the lives of all princes were too easy, they had to suffer as an expiation for the good things taken without thought by preceding generations.